21 Most dangerous weapons tested on civilians. Chemical weapons testing 1915 to 1918. From 1915 to 1918, during World War I's desperate search for battlefield advantages, German forces deployed chlorine and mustard gas against Allied trenches, but also conducted secret experiments on prisoners of war and occupied civilian populations, testing dosages and exposure methods that would later inform chemical warfare doctrine while causing agonizing deaths and permanent disabilities. Biological warfare experiments 1931 to 1945. From 1931 to 1945, as part of its biological warfare program during the invasion of China, Japan's Unit 731 conducted horrific experiments on Chinese civilians, releasing plague-infected fleas over villages, testing frostbite weapons on living subjects, and performing vivisections without anesthesia to study weapon effects on human anatomy. Anthrax contamination testing 1942. In 1942, during World War II research into biological agents, British scientists released anthrax spores on Gruinard Island off Scotland using sheep as test subjects. But the experiment contaminated the island for decades and raised questions about similar tests conducted on unwitting civilian populations in colonial territories. Operation Sea Spray Bacterial Release 1950 to 1969. From 1950 to 1969, during Cold War fears of Soviet biological attacks, the U.S. military conducted Operation Sea Spray and similar programs, releasing bacterial agents over San Francisco, New York subway systems, and other populated areas to test dispersal patterns, while exposing millions of civilians to potentially harmful microorganisms. MK-Ultra Mind Control Drugs 1953. In 1953, as part of the CIA's MK-Ultra Mind Control program, American researchers administered LSD and other psychoactive drugs to unsuspecting civilians in hospitals, prisons, and mental institutions, causing permanent psychological damage and several deaths while testing chemical weapons for interrogation and crowd control. Nuclear Fallout Exposure Studies 1955 to 1975. From 1955 to 1975, during atmospheric nuclear testing in Nevada, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission deliberately exposed civilian populations downwind to radioactive fallout, studying cancer rates and genetic damage in Utah, Arizona, and Nevada communities while withholding health warnings and medical treatment. Agent Orange Chemical Defoliation 1968. In 1968, during the Vietnam War's chemical defoliation campaign, the U.S. military sprayed Agent Orange containing dioxin over populated areas of South Vietnam, testing the weapon's effectiveness against both jungle cover and civilian agriculture, causing birth defects and cancer that persist generations later. Riot Control Agent Testing 1960 to 1970. From 1960 to 1970, amid civil rights protests and urban unrest, U.S. police departments tested experimental riot control agents including CS gas, pepper compounds, and incapacitating chemicals on civilian demonstrators, using protests as real-world laboratories for crowd control weapons development. Soviet thermobaric weapons 1979. In 1979, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Russian forces deployed experimental thermobaric weapons and chemical agents against Mujahideen fighters in villages, but the weapons indiscriminately killed civilians in underground tunnel systems and cave complexes, testing fuel-air explosives that would later be refined for urban warfare. Iran-Iraq War Chemical Testing 1980 to 1988. From 1980 to 1988, during the Iran-Iraq War's chemical weapons escalation, both sides used civilian populations as testing grounds for nerve agents, mustard gas, and experimental compounds, with Iraqi forces using Kurdish villages as laboratories to test delivery methods and dosages of chemical weapons. Bhabalpur Disaster Weapons Research 1984. In 1984, following the Bhabalpur industrial disaster in India, weapons manufacturers studied the accidental release of methyl isocyanate gas that killed thousands, using the tragedy as an unintended field test for chemical weapons dispersal in urban environments and civilian vulnerability studies. Yugoslav Wars Experimental Weapons 1991 to 2001. From 1991 to 2001, during the Yugoslav War's ethnic cleansing campaigns, Serbian forces tested experimental weapons including modified cluster bombs and chemical irritants on civilian populations in Srebrenica and other besieged cities, using siege warfare as a testing ground for urban warfare weapons. Domestic sonic weapons testing 1995. In 1995, amid fears of domestic terrorism following the Oklahoma City bombing, U.S. law enforcement agencies tested military-grade sonic weapons, microwave pain rays, and electromagnetic pulse devices on civilian protesters and prison populations to develop non-lethal crowd control capabilities. Depleted uranium ammunition 1999 to 2003. From 1999 to 2003, during NATO's intervention in the Balkans and subsequent Iraq invasion, military forces deployed experimental depleted uranium ammunition in populated areas, testing the weapon's effectiveness against armored targets while exposing civilian populations to radioactive contamination and studying long-term health effects. Chechnya fuel-air explosives 2000. In 2000, as part of Russia's Second Chechen War counterinsurgency operations, Russian forces tested thermobaric bombs and experimental fuel-air explosives in urban environments using civilian areas of Grozny as testing grounds for weapons that would later be deployed in Syria and Ukraine. Directed energy weapons testing 2004 to 2014. From 2004 to 2014, during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, U.S. and coalition forces tested experimental directed energy weapons including active denial systems and laser dazzlers on civilian populations at checkpoints and during urban operations, studying psychological effects and crowd dispersal capabilities. Gazadyne weapons testing 2008. In 2008, during Israel's Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, military forces tested experimental white phosphorus delivery systems and dense inert metal explosive dime weapons in populated areas, using the civilian population as test subjects for urban warfare weapons while studying fragmentation patterns and casualty rates. Syrian Chemical Weapons Program 2011 present. From 2011 to present, during the Syrian civil war's chemical weapons attacks, government forces and their allies have systematically deployed chlorine gas, sarin, and experimental nerve agents against civilian populations in Aleppo, eastern Ghouta, and other areas, treating besieged communities as laboratories for chemical weapons effectiveness. Hong Kong crowd control testing 2014. In 2014, amid pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, Chinese authorities tested experimental crowd control weapons including sound cannons, water cannons with chemical irritants, and electromagnetic pulse devices on civilian demonstrators, refining non-lethal weapons for future deployment against dissent. Myanmar incendiary weapons 2017 to 2022. From 2017 to 2022. From 2017 to 2022, during the conflict in Myanmar's Rakhine State, military forces tested experimental incendiary weapons and chemical agents against Rohingya civilian populations, using ethnic cleansing operations as testing grounds for weapons designed to force mass displacement and prevent return. Domestic protest weapon testing 2020. In 2020, during widespread civil unrest following police killings, U.S. law enforcement agencies deployed experimental crowd control weapons including acoustic cannons, microwave pain devices, and advanced tear gas compounds on civilian protesters, using domestic demonstrations as field tests for urban warfare capabilities that have since been exported globally.